Good morning. So today, here's what we're after. We're after being able to identify what made new immigrants to the United States different than old immigrants to the US, because we're going to see a significant, huge shift in who immigrants are during the Gilded Age and where they're settling and where they're working. So it's going to be very different in the Gilded Age than beforehand. My goal is that you can explain why immigrants settled in urban areas, primarily in the cities, often in neighborhoods known as immigrant neighborhoods, like Little Italies, for example. I can continue developing my background for Gilded Age, my Gilded Age invention pitch. So that is something that you're going to be doing today. I'm meeting with a lot of folks today and some folks tomorrow on that topic. But without further ado, let's dig into today's lesson. So we're looking at immigration and really focusing in on this wave here, this peak here of immigration. This is going to be referred to as new immigration to the United States, whereas these folks here are going to be referred to as old immigrants to the United States. And we're going to look at what makes them different as groups of people, why we call them new versus old immigrants. So millions of immigrants came to the United States from Northern Europe in the mid-1800s. So we're talking here, right? Folks coming in from Northern Europe. They came mainly from Great Britain, Germany, Ireland, and the countries of Scandinavia. And with the exception of Irish immigrants they were being pushed out by the potato famine. The Irish were Roman Catholics, but most of the other immigrants during old immigration were Protestants. Many were skilled workers. They came with a skill set, like maybe they shoot horses and made horseshoes for a living, for example, or made barrels, were coopers. Other people, though, settled in rural areas and became farmers. By the late 1800s, however, immigrants from Northern Europe, we called those old immigrants because a newer, larger wave of immigrants started coming into the United States from different parts of the world. So now here's the shift. So now what we're going to do is describe who are these folks coming into the United States. And as you can see, they're coming from very different places. During the 1880s, more than 5 million immigrants arrived to the United States, which is about the same number of people that had been coming in the 6 decades from about 1800 to 1860 combined. So huge wave. The majority of these new immigrants were from Southern and Eastern Europe, the nations of Czechoslovakia, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Poland, Russia. And they came to the United States pulled by new opportunities in the hope of a better life, right? These new immigrants came from many different cultural and religious backgrounds. Many of them were Roman Catholics. Many of them were also Jewish. Many of them were escaping political or religious persecution. So something that pushed them out is they were being kicked around by government or the people of their nation because of their religious beliefs, which may have been different, and also their political beliefs. And what pulled them here, they were eager for the job opportunities created by that industrial boom of the late 1800s, right? That rise of industry in the United States. Okay, so most of the people arriving in this time period traveled by ship to the United States, right? So we see the old wave coming in from Northern Europe and Western Europe, and we have this new larger wave coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe. Yes, we do have Latin American immigrants coming to the United States, and we also have immigrants coming in our West Coast and Canadian immigrants as well. But the bulk of immigrants came from here that we're talking about, and they traveled in what was called steerage. And that is really the lower deck, the lower decks of ships where the steering mechanisms were located, because the steerage tickets were cheap, but the cabins were hot. It was nasty in steerage. It was awful for folks. A lot of them were seasick along the way. Now, once they arrived to the United States, they had to be processed, and I think you know about this. On the East Coast, they were processed at Ellis Island, and they processed hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming primarily from Europe, right? And only about 2% of the people who arrived at Ellis Island here on the East Coast of the United States were actually turned around and sent back. Um, on the west coast of the United States, we have another immigration station, and that was called Angel Island, and it was opened near San Francisco. And there are limitations on the number of Asian immigrants that we would allow into the country. And oftentimes, Chinese immigrants were kept at Angel Island for weeks or even months while officials investigated their families. The goal at Angel Island on the West Coast was to keep people out, where the goal on the East Coast, Ellis Island, was to bring people in. And as you can see, we have this European family. We can infer they're from Europe because they're standing on Ellis Island and they are looking at that growing skyline. Thank you, cheap steel, right? Of the city of New York. And these are folks standing outside a processing center on Angel Island on the west coast of the United States. So if immigrants got into the United States, we're going to focus on the East Coast here because we'll use New York City as kind of our test city, if you will, or our focus city. So once immigrants came into or through Ellis Island, right? So you see the Statue of Liberty on the map, Ellis Island, most of them headed into what's known as Lower Manhattan, part of the city of New York. And they needed housing, right? That's the first thing you probably need is you need a place to live, and then you probably need to find yourself a job pretty quickly. So once folks hit here from Ellis Island, many of them, traveled just inland just a little bit and started to settle here, primarily in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which became a thriving set of immigrant neighborhoods. You see Little Italy. We also have Chinatown, the Lower East Side, the East Village, right? So let's continue along here. And this is a picture of Mulberry Street in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And this is one of those immigrant neighborhoods. So once they entered the U.S., immigrants had to find a way to adjust to life in this new country, finding homes and jobs. They had to try to learn a new language, try to get used to these new customs. They had to try to adapt to this new nation where they were living and try to build a new life. And they settled into neighborhoods that were full of others from the same country. And in these neighborhoods, they could speak their native language, eat the foods that reminded them of home. They could also practice the customs that their families had passed down, generation to generation. It felt like home. It sounded like home. It smelled like home, right, in these new immigrant neighborhoods. And they started to publish newspapers in their own languages. They set up schools. They set up clubs. They set up churches and synagogues, all making it feel like home, but in this new home of the United States. They set up shops, neighborhood banks. They would lend money to one another. So that's why we have folks kind of clustering together. There's safety there, right? However, even with all this support, oftentimes the housing was incredibly crowded. Most immigrants lived upstairs over shops. As you can see here, these are known as tenements. They're these really tiny, cramped, poorly built, overcrowded apartment buildings, and they didn't have a whole lot of light, ventilation, sanitation. There was no regular trash pickup yet in these growing cities, and they're really unhealthy places to live. And we had some of the worst diseases spread throughout these neighborhoods in the United States, due to all the overcrowding and sanitation problems and so on and so forth, right? But folks are really working hard to try to adjust as their parents start going off to work in factories that we'll take a look at in just a second. They have to figure out what to do with kids. What do we do with the kids? This is also the time period, you lucky ducks, we start to see the rise of public education. You have to have something for the kids to do all day long. Plus, it's a way to bring kids into the American culture, teaching them the language. It's not an official language, but it's the traditional language, which of course is English. Teaching them civics and government, history, math, all those things that go along with being citizens. So most immigrants, however, as I mentioned, had to find work quickly, right? Most of them stayed in the cities because this is where we're seeing the rise of those factories and the mechanization and the new inventions. And so they settled in cities. And because they didn't have great language acquisition, they did not have a whole lot of skill sets. They ended up working in factories that may have looked like this for very little pay. And sometimes these workplaces were called sweatshops because of the long hours and really hot and unhealthy working conditions, right? And over here we have a picture of some young women working in a factory in which they're making what are called shirtwaists. You can see them piled here, and they're tops, right? And this is a quote from a woman working in one of those factories. When the shirtwaist, the tops, the blouse were finished at the machine, we were given scissors to cut the threads off. It wasn't heavy work, but it was boring, monotonous, because you did the same thing from 7:30 in the morning till 9 at night. 7:30 a.m. to 9 at night. And this is where we see people start to say, whoa, 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 those hours are far too long. How about unionizing? Right? This is where we start to see the development of unions. We also have many workers working. This picture is from Chicago. Chicago was also a growing city in the United States at the time, and this is where we see the rise of the meat slaughtering industry, the meat packing plants, if you will. This is from the Swift meat packing plant. Tomorrow, you'll take a quick look at a piece I have for you about the working conditions related to the meat packing industry. Again, this is a place where immigrants could find work. The work was incredibly difficult, and the work did not require a whole lot of skill. The work did not require a whole lot of acquisition of the language, and the working conditions, were to say they were rough is an understatement. So we'll take a look at that piece tomorrow. All right, so that's your lesson for today. I'm going to drop this whole slideshow into Google Classroom so you can use this last slide to continue your work with your pitch. But that is your lesson for today, taking a look at new immigrants and new immigration to the United States.